The wind owned this land, a desolate king ruling an empire of dust and brittle grass. Please, just for the night. The man on the porch did not move. He stood like a feature of the landscape itself, weathered and unyielding, his face a map of sun and hardship. Below him, a woman held the hand of a small girl, her own face pale with exhaustion, her plea swallowed almost immediately by the ceaseless wind. A question hung in the vast, empty space between them, a question of mercy in a place that offered none. This was how things changed, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet arrival of a burden he had not asked for. Cale watched them from the shade of his porch, his eyes narrowed against the afternoon glare. He had seen them coming for the better part of an hour, a slow, dark speck against the bleached horizon, resolving itself into the tired shapes of a woman and child, pulling a rickety handcart. He had seen their kind before. They were the dust of the westward churn, families broken by drought or sickness or simple bad luck, drifting until they settled or were scattered for good. He had made it a rule to offer nothing. His solitude was a fortress, each stone laid with a memory he had no wish to disturb. He had enough ghosts inside his cabin. He had no room for living ones. The woman's dress was a patchwork of faded calico, worn thin at the elbows and hem. The child, a girl no older than 5, clung to her mother's skirt, her small face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide and dark as she stared up at him. They were a portrait of weary desperation. The handcart held their whole world. A rolled blanket, a dented pot, a wooden crate tied with fraying rope. It listed to one side, its axle groaning with every gust of wind. "The barn," he said. The words felt foreign in his throat, rough from disuse. "There's hay. Water from the pump." The woman, Ilara, flinched at the sound of his voice, as if she had expected only silence. She looked from his hard-set face to the sturdy, gray wood barn standing 50 yards from the cabin. It was more than she had hoped for. It was shelter. It was safety for a night. She gave a short, jerky nod, unable to form a word of thanks. Her throat was too tight with relief and fear. He watched as she guided the child toward the barn, her shoulders slumped but her steps determined. He did not offer to help with the cart. He did not move from his post. He was a sentinel guarding a border, and he had just allowed 2 strangers to cross it. He could feel the foundations of his quiet world shift beneath his feet. The wind picked up, howling a low, mournful tune around the corners of his cabin, a sound he had always found comforting in its loneliness. Tonight it sounded different. It sounded like a warning. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of dry hay and old leather. Dust motes danced in the slanted bars of light piercing the cracks in the walls. Ilara let out a long, shuddering breath. She unrolled their single, thin blanket onto a pile of clean straw in an empty stall. The little girl, Lyra, immediately curled up on it, her small body finally succumbing to the day's long walk. Ilara watched her, a fierce, protective ache in her chest. She had promised the child they would find a safe place. For one night, at least, she had not lied. She walked to the wide barn doors and peered out. The man was still on his porch, a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. He had not looked their way again. She did not know if he was a kind man who had offered charity or a dangerous one who was biding his time. Out here, the two often looked the same. She pulled the heavy barn door mostly shut, leaving only a crack for air. The sound of it groaning on its iron hinges was loud in the sudden quiet. She retreated into the shadows of the stall. She would not sleep. Cale finished cleaning the rifle, his hands moving with the practiced ease of long habit. He could feel their presence in the barn as keenly as a change in the weather, a disruption. He had built this life out of the wreckage of another, cultivating silence and solitude like a crop. For 5 years, no one had stayed the night on his land. He had turned away prospectors, drifters, even a preacher with a hollow look in his eyes. But the woman and the child. He had seen the way the girl's small hand was swallowed up in her mother's, a desperate anchor in a sea of dust. It had reminded him of another hand, another time, a memory he kept locked away. He rose and went inside his cabin. It was a single room, sparse and clean. A narrow bed, a stone hearth, a table with one chair. On a small shelf sat a single, polished river stone, smooth and gray. He ran a thumb over its cool surface. He banked the fire and lay down on his cot, but sleep did not come. Through the single window he could see the dark shape of the barn. He was accustomed to the night sounds, the cry of a coyote, the rustle of the wind, the creak of old wood. But tonight he listened for a different sound. A cough, a cry, a footstep in the hay. He heard nothing but the wind. He had given them shelter. He hoped it would be enough. The sun rose thin and pale, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. Alara was already awake, having dozed only fitfully. Lyra was still asleep, her breath a soft, even whisper in the hay-scented dark. Alara crept to the pump, her bare feet cold on the hard-packed earth. She worked the handle, the shriek of metal a rude intrusion into the morning calm. When she turned, a pail of water in her hand, she saw him. He was standing by the barn door, holding a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He said nothing, just extended it toward her. She hesitated, her eyes flicking from the bundle to his unreadable face. Finally, she took it. It was still warm. Inside the cloth were 2 baked potatoes and a thick slice of salted jerky. It was more food than she and Lyra had seen in 3 days. "We'll be gone before noon," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was important he knew she was not a beggar. She would not be a burden. He gave a slight nod and turned away, heading toward the small corral where his single horse stood waiting. He moved with a stiff grace, a slight limp in his left leg she hadn't noticed before. He did not look back. Alara took the food into the barn. Lyra was awake now, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. When she saw the potato, her face split into a grin that made Alara's heart ache. They ate in silence, savoring every bite. The food was a simple kindness, but it felt complicated. It was a debt, and she had nothing to pay it with. After they ate, she set about their small chores. She re-rolled the blanket, tidied the hay, and washed their faces with a corner of her apron dipped in the cold well water. She looked at the handcart. One of its wheels was badly warped, wobbling precariously on its axle. It had been a slow, agonizing journey yesterday, and it would not last another mile. She felt a familiar knot of despair tighten in her stomach. She had no tools, no wood, no skill to fix it. She spent the morning trying, using a rock to hammer the bent iron brace back into place. But it was no use. The metal was too fatigued. Noon came and went. The sun beat down on the dusty yard. Cale returned from wherever he had been, unsaddled his horse, and went into his cabin without a word to her. She had broken her promise. They were still here. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. She could not leave, but she could not stay. She was trapped by a broken wheel and the silent charity of a stranger. That evening, he appeared again, this time with a wooden bucket. It held a rabbit, skinned and cleaned. He set it on the ground near the barn door and walked away. Alara stared at it. She had a pot, but no way to make a fire. As if reading her thoughts, he returned a few moments later, carrying a small armful of firewood and a tinderbox. He placed them beside the bucket. "There's a fire pit behind the barn," he said, his voice low. "Keep it small." Then he was gone again, retreating into the fortress of his cabin. That night, for the first time in weeks, Alara and Lyra ate a hot meal. The stew was thin, mostly water and a few wild onions Alara had found near the pump, but the meat was rich and filling. It warmed them from the inside out. As Lyra drifted off to sleep with a full belly, Alara felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. It was a fragile, dangerous thing. It was hope. The next day, a routine began to form, unspoken and delicate. In the morning, he would leave food, an egg from his small coop, a piece of hard bread. She, in turn, began to work. She saw the tattered state of his horse blanket, draped over the corral fence. She took it down, painstakingly washed it in the trough, and spent the entire afternoon with her small sewing kit, mending the tears with neat, tiny stitches. When she was done, she folded it and left it where she had found it. She saw a loose shutter on his cabin, banging in the relentless wind. Using a heavy stone, she hammered the wooden pin back into place, silencing the irritating noise. She did these things while he was gone, riding out onto the plains each day. She did not want him to see her. This was not an offering. It was a balancing of the scales. She would not be in his debt. He never acknowledged her work. But the next morning, beside the usual offering of food, she found a small bar of lye soap. Lyra, meanwhile, was becoming bolder. The man was a fearsome, silent figure, but he was also the source of the food that filled her belly and the safety of the barn that kept the night creatures away. She would watch him from the barn doorway, a small, curious shadow. She saw him carving a piece of wood one afternoon, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. The next day, she found a small, smooth wooden bird left on the pump handle. Its wings were swept back as if in flight. She clutched it in her hand, her first toy in over a year. She knew, with the certainty of a child, that the silent man had made it for her. He watched them more than they knew. From the window of his cabin, or from the shade of the porch, he observed their quiet industry. He saw the way Alara moved, with a weary grace that spoke of a life of hard work and heavier burdens. He saw the way she brushed Lyra's tangled hair, her touch gentle and patient. He saw the flash of sunlight on her sewing needle as she repaired her daughter's torn dress. They brought a strange, unwelcome softness to the harsh edges of his world. One evening he was late returning. The sky was bruising to a deep purple, and a storm was gathering on the horizon, a dark wall of clouds building in the west. Alara found herself scanning the empty plains, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was a foolish feeling. His absence was none of her concern, but the thought of him out there with that storm coming was unsettling. When he finally appeared, a dark rider against the bruised sky, she felt a flood of relief that angered her. She had no right to it. That night, the storm broke. The wind that had been their constant companion became a shrieking demon, tearing at the roof of the barn. Rain came down in solid, deafening sheets. Lyra whimpered in her sleep, burrowing closer to Alara. Through the cracks in the walls, lightning bleached the world white for a split second, followed by claps of thunder that shook the very ground. Alara sat up, holding her daughter, her heart pounding. The barn, which had felt so sturdy and safe, now seemed fragile, a wooden box about to be splintered by the rage of the storm. Suddenly, the barn door was wrenched open. Cale stood there, soaked to the bone, his face grim in the flashing light. He held a lantern, its flame guttering wildly in the wind. "Come!" he shouted over the roar of the storm. "Now!" He didn't wait for an answer. He strode to them, scooped the sleeping Lyra up in one arm, blanket and all, and turned back toward the door. Alara scrambled to her feet and followed, clutching the wooden bird Lyra had dropped. They ran through the blinding rain, the mud sucking at her bare feet. The short distance to the cabin felt like a mile. He pushed the door open, and they stumbled inside, into the warm, dry dark. He gently laid Lyra on his own narrow cot. The child stirred but did not wake. He shut the door, plunging the room into near blackness, the storm now a muffled roar outside. He struck a match and lit the lamp on the table. In its soft, golden glow, the small cabin seemed like a sanctuary. A fire was already laid in the hearth. He knelt and set it ablaze. Alara stood dripping by the door, clutching the small bird, feeling utterly out of place. This was his home, his private space. She had no right to be here. "Your blanket is soaked," he said, his back to her as he tended the fire. He gestured with his head toward a heavy wool coat hanging from a peg by the door. "Take that." She hesitated. It was his coat. It was a part of him. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and her dress was plastered to her skin. She took the coat down. It was heavy, smelling of leather, wood smoke, and the man himself. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It was huge on her, but it was warmer than anything she had ever known. The fire caught, and flames began to lick up the logs, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He rose and turned to her. For the first time, they were face to face indoors in a shared space. The storm raged outside. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. He had brought them into his fortress. The walls were down. The storm lasted 2 days. They were confined to the small cabin, a world unto themselves. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of the yard, but something softer, shaped by the close quarters and the shared shelter. He gave Alara his bed and slept on a pallet of blankets by the fire, never complaining. He moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency, cooking thin gruel and brewing a bitter herbal tea on the hearth. On the second day, Lyra's cheeks grew flushed, and her breathing became ragged. A fever had taken hold. Alara's fear returned, cold and sharp. Sickness on the trail was a death sentence. She bathed the child's forehead with a damp cloth, her hands trembling. Lyra tossed and turned, murmuring in her fevered sleep. Cale watched from his seat by the fire. He saw the panic in Alara's eyes, the desperate way she tended to her child. He got up and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, one she had not seen him open before. He took out a small leather pouch. He knelt by the fire, crushing dried leaves and roots with the handle of his knife, mixing them with hot water in a tin cup. The cabin filled with a pungent, earthy smell. He brought the cup to the bedside. "Let her drink this," he said. His voice was soft. "It will break the fever." Alara looked from the dark, steaming liquid to his face. There was no command in his eyes, only a quiet certainty. She trusted him. She didn't know why, but she did. She lifted Lyra's head and gently spooned the bitter medicine into her mouth. The child coughed and sputtered but swallowed most of it. All through the night he sat with them. He did not sleep. He kept the fire fed and the cabin warm. When Lyra cried out, he was there with another cup of the tea. Alara dozed in the chair beside the bed, the heavy wool coat still wrapped around her. Sometime before dawn, she woke to find him placing a cool, damp cloth on Lyra's forehead, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle. He was humming a low, guttural chant that was more of a vibration than a song. It was a sound of immense sadness and of immense strength. In that moment, she saw past the stoic, silent man. She saw a deep well of pain inside him, a pain he had learned to live with, a pain that had taught him how to heal. She felt a profound and startling connection to him, a kinship of the broken. By morning, the storm had passed, and the sun shone with a clean, washed brightness. Lyra's fever was gone. She was weak, but her eyes were clear, and she asked for a drink of water in a small, thin voice. The relief that washed over Alara was so powerful it made her dizzy. She looked at Cale, who was staring out the window at the new day. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt small, inadequate for what he had done. He turned from the window. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the guard was down. She saw the full weight of the sorrow he carried. "No one should lose a child," he said, his voice thick. And then he looked away, the wall back in place. But she had seen it. She knew. They fell back into a routine, but it was different now. They shared the space of the cabin. He did not ask them to leave, and she did not offer. It was understood. She took over the cooking, making the most of their meager supplies. She mended his shirts, her stitches as neat and careful as the ones she had used on his horse blanket. She swept the floor and washed the single window until it sparkled. She was making a home of this place, not with possessions, but with her care. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small fragments. He told her the name of the hawk that circled their land. He showed her which roots were good to eat and which were poison. He explained that the limp in his leg was from an old wound, a reminder of a fight he had lost long ago. He never spoke of who he had fought or why, but he was sharing parts of himself, small stones from the wall he had built around his heart. One evening, as she was washing their tin plates, He spoke from his chair by the fire. He was carving again, his knife moving rhythmically over a piece of cottonwood. "My wife," he began, and the word hung in the air heavy and strange. "She made a stew like that. With wild onions." He fell silent, his eyes on the wood in his hands. Alara stopped her work, her hands still in the soapy water. She waited. "We had a son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He had his mother's smile. The fever took them both. In the same week, he did not look at her. The knife in his hand was still. "My people, they believed it was a curse. They left me. They left this place. Left for dead," she thought. Not by an enemy, but by his own kin, abandoned to his grief in a land haunted by ghosts. It explained everything. The isolation, the silence, the profound sadness she had seen in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He looked up then, and his eyes were not hard. They were just weary. It was a long time ago. He went back to his carving. The conversation was over, but the most important things had been said. Lyra became the bridge between their two solitudes. She was no longer afraid of him. She would follow him as he did his chores, chattering away to him, telling him about the wooden bird, about the shape of the clouds, about the dreams she had at night. He rarely answered, but he would listen. Sometimes, she would sit near his feet while he worked, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. One day, he looked down to see what she had drawn. It was 3 figures. A tall one, a medium one, and a small one, all holding hands under a smiling sun. He stared at it for a long time. Then he reached down and gently smudged it away with the toe of his boot before she could see the moisture gathering in his eyes. A month passed, then 2. The warped wheel of the handcart lay forgotten behind the barn. The seasons began to turn. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. They had saved enough from Kale's trapping and Alara's careful foraging to make a trip to the nearest town for supplies. It was a 2-day ride, a place Kale had not visited in over a year. He was reluctant to go, but they needed flour and salt, and Lyra needed new shoes. The town was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. It was loud and crowded, a stark contrast to the quiet of their homestead. People stared at them. They saw a rough, scarred man with a slight limp, a woman in a faded but clean dress, and a small child clutching his hand. They made for a strange family. Alara felt the weight of their gazes, the whispered comments she could not quite hear. She kept her eyes down, her hand tight on Lyra's. Kale seemed oblivious, his face set in its usual stoic mask, but she could feel the tension in his shoulders. He led them to the mercantile, his presence a silent shield around them. As they were leaving the store, their supplies loaded into saddlebags, a man stepped out of the saloon and blocked their path. He was large and fleshy, dressed in a tailored suit that was out of place in the dusty town. His face was florid, and his eyes were small and mean. "Well, well, if it isn't Alara," the man sneered. "I heard you'd run off. Left a considerable debt behind, as I recall." Alara froze. Her face went white. It was Silas Blackwood, the man who had owned the last farm they worked, the man whose cruelty had forced them to flee in the middle of the night. "I owe you nothing, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We worked off our debt." "My ledgers say otherwise," he said, taking a step closer. He leered at her. "But perhaps we can come to a new arrangement. A pretty woman like you shouldn't be traveling with this savage." His eyes flicked to Kale with open contempt. Kale did not move. He watched Blackwood, his expression unchanging, but a dangerous stillness had settled over him. It was the stillness of a predator before it strikes. "Leave us be," Alara said, trying to pull Lyra behind her. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I don't think so. You belong to me until your debt is paid. The law is on my side." He reached out, his hand aiming to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, Kale moved. It was not a fast movement, but it was absolute. He stepped between them, placing himself directly in Blackwood's path. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, an immovable object. Then, he did something that spoke louder than any threat. He reached back, his hand gently settling on Alara's shoulder. It was a simple gesture. An act of possession. An act of protection. He looked directly into Blackwood's eyes. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The entire street had stopped to watch. "She is with me," Cale said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of an iron declaration. It was not a plea or a threat. It was a statement of fact. A line drawn in the dust. In that moment, he was not just a reclusive homesteader. He was the man he used to be, a leader, a protector of his own. He was claiming his family. Blackwood's bluster evaporated under the force of Cale's gaze. He saw something in the man's dark eyes that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was a history of violence, held in check by a powerful will. He swallowed hard, his face losing some of its color. He took a half-step back. "This ain't over," he muttered, but there was no conviction in it. He turned and retreated back into the saloon, defeated not by force, but by a quiet, unshakable resolve. Cale kept his hand on Alara's shoulder for a moment longer. He could feel her trembling beneath his touch. He gave it a slight, reassuring squeeze before letting go. He turned and lifted Lyra into his arms, settling her on his hip. He looked at Alara, his eyes soft. "Let's go home," he said. The ride back was quiet, but the silence was different again. It was filled with the echo of his words. "She is with me." It was a promise. It was a vow. When they arrived back at the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. Felt like a real homecoming. That evening, Alara unpacked the supplies, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed the sack of flour in the bin. She put the new shoes by Lyra's bed. She looked around the small cabin, at the fire burning in the hearth, at the child sleeping peacefully on the cot, at the man sitting in his chair watching her. This was not a shelter anymore. It was a home. It was their home. The days that followed were filled with a gentle rhythm. They worked together, preparing for the coming winter. They repaired the roof of the barn, Cale working on the high beams while Alara handed him shingles. They dug a small root cellar, their hands working side by side in the cool earth. They planted a small winter garden, Lyra carefully placing seeds into the furrows her mother made. Laughter, once a foreign sound in this place, became more frequent. It was usually Lyra's, a bright, bubbling sound that seemed to make the very air lighter. But sometimes, a rare, low chuckle would rumble in Cale's chest at something the child said or did, and Alara would smile, a true, unguarded smile that reached her eyes and made her beautiful. One afternoon, Cale came in from chopping wood to find Alara sitting in the old rocking chair he had built for his wife, a chair that had sat empty and still for 5 long years. She was mending one of Lyra's dresses, the chair moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Creak, squeak, creak, squeak. The sound should have been an agony to him, a fresh tearing of an old wound. But it wasn't. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of peace. He stood in the doorway and watched her, a feeling of profound rightness settling over him. The ghosts were quiet. The house was full. He walked over to the hearth and picked up the polished river stone from the mantel, the one he had kept all these years. It was the only thing he had left of his son, who had found it by the creek the day before the fever came. He held it in his palm, its weight familiar and sorrowful. He walked to the rocking chair. Alara looked up at him, her hands stilling in her lap. He wordlessly opened his hand and showed her the stone. She understood. She knew what it was, what it represented. She reached out and gently closed his fingers back over it. "You don't have to let them go," she said, her voice soft. "You just have to make room." He looked down at his closed fist, and then at her. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He went back to the mantel and placed the stone back in its spot. Then he turned and looked at the empty peg by the door where his heavy wool coat used to hang. It was no longer there. It was hanging on a peg on the other side of the room, next to Alara's thin shawl. It had found a new place. He had made room. From silence came a language. From hardship came a bond. The wind still howled across the plains, a lonely and desolate sound, but it no longer found its way inside the cabin. Inside there was warmth. There was the gentle creak of a rocking chair and the soft breathing of a sleeping child. There was the quiet strength of a man who had faced his ghosts and the resilient love of a woman who had found her harbor. A home had been built not with nails and wood, but with small kindnesses and a shared, unspoken understanding. A family had been forged in the crucible of a harsh and unforgiving land. That night, as the fire burned low, he sat at the small table, oiling a piece of leather. Elara came and sat in the other chair, the one that had always been empty. She said nothing, simply sat with him in the comfortable quiet. After a time, she reached across the table and laid her hand on his. Her touch was light, tentative. He stopped his work. He slowly turned his own hand over and laced his fingers through hers. Her skin was calloused from work, but it was warm. It was real. He looked at her, and in the dim firelight, he saw not a burden, not a stranger, but his future. He saw the end of his long exile. The coat remained on its new hook, a silent testament. Promise made and kept. She stayed.